Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to see what happens when we use a revisor inside of another revisor, specifically the calculate function inside of another calculate function, right? So it's going to be a lot like the movie Inception if the movie Inception took place in an Excel spreadsheet. And the results are about what you expect, maybe, but just seeing it happen on the screen, I think, is very useful. So let's go ahead and do it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? So I'm here in Filter Revisors Part 1.xlsx, and I'm in the Calc times 2 tab. And here we are. I'm going to sort of move down a little bit. We're running a little short on room, right? Which is sort of a problem that we have a lot here. And so one of the things I've done here in our snippet of code is here on line 5, where it says that the SumX mini units. This thing that we've seen 1,000 times, I've rewritten it to be on one line just so we can get everything else to fit. This is the same code we've done 1,000 times. The only difference is rather than having it on, 1, 2, 3, 4 separate lines, I squeezed it into one, which makes it a little bit harder to read, but I think at this point you kind of get it. Okay, so here's the code that we're going to run. And in this code, this snippet of code right here, at the very tip top is a calculate function, and then underneath that is another calculate function. So we're going to see how this works. And you can already see that we're essentially going to have a sub-expression within a sub-expression. So, well, let's see how it works. So whenever we run into calculate, the first thing we want to do is we want to find the sub-expression of calculate and freeze it with our eyeballs. Now here in Excel, I'm actually going to color it by changing the background, but when you're working in Power BI on your own, you want to freeze that first argument, that sub-expression, to remind yourself that it's the thing that's going to happen after everything else happens. Okay, so the sub-expression, it kind of goes from right there to there, right? It's, yeah, there we go. That'll work. So it's argument 1 of calculate, right? And so this is the stuff that's going to change the filters, and this is the bit that's going to be frozen, if I can freeze it right here. There we go, frozen, in a block of ice to only be unfrozen after we change the filters, and we will then run it. Okay, and you can maybe already see where this is going, but let's just sort of step through this one piece at a time. Okay, so calculate, there's a sub-expression. How are we going to change the filters? Well, we're going to do it with the temp table derived from this snippet of code down there, which we're going to get by deriving that temp table using the filter iterator to add this column to it and just keep the true rows. Okay, so right now the filter context is empty. We're going to go get this derivation where we get all the different values of shift regardless of what filters are in the filter context. That's what the all column derivation does. And so what do we have? Well, we've got lunch and dinner, which you probably could have guessed. You've seen that a lot now. So I'm going to type in shift right here. I'm going to type in lunch and dinner. That is the derivation, right? The temp table created by the derivation on line 14, which we're then going to pass into the filter iterator, which will add this expression column to it and keep the true results. And I've actually, because I'm lazy, I've already done that ahead of time. So I'm going to type in EXP. I also want the video to go nice and fast. So I type in EXP, and when I hit enter, we'll notice that we've already got the formula in there. For each and every row, we go check to see if that row's shift is equal to lunch. Lunch is equal to lunch, so we get a true. Dinner does not equal lunch, so we get a false. And the filter iterator is going to keep the one true row right there, right? Now, in a different iterator, we could have multiple true rows, but in this one, we just got that one right there. So we're going to keep that true row right there. Okay. Speaking of which, I'm going to type in shift, and I'm going to type in lunch, right? And I'm going to just hit enter, right? And so that is the temp table that this bit of code right here produces, which calculate is going to use as an override filter. Calculate's going to say, hey, I'm going to take that temp table right there, add it to the filter context, then once I'm done revising the filters, or I am done revising the filters, I will go ahead and unfreeze this block of code and run it. So let's do that. So I'm going to select this code right here. I'm going to move my mouse till it, come on. Move my mouse till I get those little cardinal arrowy guys right there. I'm going to left click and drag. Now, it's more accurate to say that I move this, but I like seeing this in both places. So I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy. Notice when I hold down Control in Excel, I get that little plus symbol right there. All right, so I hold down Control, I let go, and now I've made a copy, but really I've moved the filter from there into the filter context. Okay, so if there were multiple override filters provided to calculate, we'd have to go get those and add those too, but if we look, we've just got the one override filter right there, lines 13 through 16. So now, calculate is done revising the filters. It can unfreeze the sub-expression and run it. So let's go ahead. And in fact, before we unfreeze it, let me go ahead and set the filters to lunch. So we could see sort of what the expression sees. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and get lunch. There we go. Okay, so now we've got that filter context with shift equals lunch in it. We're just seeing the lunch rows. I could go ahead and unfreeze this sub-expression, and I'm going to make this sort of gray color. So I leave a puddle behind. So, right, it was this big block of ice. We get out the hairdryer, and we unfreeze it, and it leaves a little puddle. Okay, so this bit right here is the sub-expression, which we can now run under this revised filter context. Well, what's in the sub-expression? The very first thing in the sub-expression is another calculate, which means we're going to run the filter, revise the filters again, right? So in the sub-expression is another reviser saying, hey, don't go do anything meaningful yet. We have to revise the filters again, right? So let's say, okay, let's remind ourselves with calculate, whenever we see a calculate, we want to find the sub-expression and freeze it. In this case, it's sort of this narrow sliver right there. So we're going to select that. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to freeze this again with my eyeballs. Or I'm going to freeze it here with Excel. You have to freeze it with your eyeballs when you're running your own code. That bit right there is frozen in ice, and we're only going to unfreeze it and run it after we revise the filters by adding this filter to it. This filter to it. Okay, well, that's pretty easy. So now, before we got all the rows of shift and had a filter and just kept the lunch rows, now we're going to do something similar, but we're just going to keep the dinner rows. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. Okay, so go get all of the shifts. Since we're using the all column derivation, it's actually going to ignore whatever filters are in place, right? So we actually want both lunch and dinner. So even though right now only this is visible, the all derivation right there is going to temporarily ignore the filters. Temporarily ignore the filters just long enough to get that derivation. So I'm going to type in shift. We're going to get lunch and dinner. There we go. Okay, so now we've got that all derivation right there, which produces that temp table. We're going to bring the filters back because the all function only temporarily turns off the filters. So now we're just looking at lunch. Okay, so we've got this derivation right there. We're going to add this column to it and just keep the results. That's what the filter iterator does. It adds this column to whatever temp table is provided in argument 1 and just keeps the true rows. Okay, so like before, I've already got most of the hard work done. I type in EXP, I hit enter, and it turns out lunch does not equal dinner. So what, does the shift equals dinner? No, lunch does not equal dinner. Does dinner equal dinner? It certainly does. And so the filter iterator right here, what does it produce? It produces a temp table that looks like this. Shift equals dinner. There we go. Okay, good. So now calculate is going to take this temp table, add it to the filter context, right? And then it can unfreeze and run its sub-expression. Notice this is interesting, right? We already have a filter in there for shift equals lunch. We're about to add one for shift equals dinner. So what's going to happen in this circumstance? Well, one way I could represent this is I could just take this temp table and just drag it right on top of the other temp table, and that's a pretty reasonable way if you're getting started to think of it. It just sort of drops right on top of it. A slightly more accurate way, which I'm going to go ahead and do in this video, why not, is I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy. Hey, there's my phone. I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy and let go. There we go. So now I've added this filter for shift equals dinner, but when calculate adds it, it says, all right, we just added a filter for shift equals dinner. Are there any other filters for shift? Yeah, there's one for shift equals lunch. So what happens is when there's a conflict, the reviser, calculate, or any reviser for that matter, is going to say if there's a conflict, whatever the old version was, we're going to block. So I'm going to select this right here. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to set this just sort of this dark red color because it has been blocked, right? So it was lunch, and now we're looking at dinner. Okay. So now this calculate added a filter for lunch. This calculate adds a filter for dinner, and since this one happens afterwards, this filter for shift wins over the previous one. So now this calculate can unfreeze its sub-expression and run the results. So a second ago we were looking at lunch. Now we're looking at dinner. Hey, how about that? Okay, so now this calculate can unfreeze its sub-expression and run the results. So I'm going to right-click. I'll make it a slightly darker shade so the puddle's just even more wet right there. Okay, so we've unfrozen that block of ice. We can now run this sub-expression. Now, normally it's broken out across multiple lines, but I think by now you kind of get it. We're going to go get all the visible rows of mini, add this column to it, and sum up the results. So, all the visible rows of mini, well, at the very beginning, we could see all 7 of them. About 30 seconds ago, we could see the lunch rows. Now, we just see the dinner rows because this second reviser added the filter for dinner. So, let's go ahead and select those right there. Control-C. I'm going to come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. I'm going to go ahead and paste values and click OK. Okay, So now this temp table is a result of that derivation in the middle of line 5, right? Which we are then going to pass into the SumEx iterator, which is going to add this column to it and sum up the results. So I'm going to click right there. I'm going to type in EXP, and I hit enter. And we can see for every single row, we go get the units for that row. So we get 2, 1, and 2, and we sum up the results because it's the SumEx function. So this is going to be equal sum those values right there. I go ahead, hit enter, and I get 5, and sure enough, the answer to this thing is 5. Okay. Now, to be specific, at this point, the before we actually finish, calculate is a revisor, and so it's a good roommate, so it cleans up after itself. So we'll go ahead and we'll be good and reset the filters here for just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and set the filters back to the way they were a second ago. There we go. So we're kind of undoing that calculate. I should probably set the colors for that. You guys don't have to do this. I'm going to, just to be good, I'm going to Control-Alt-V to paste special, and I'll paste formats. There we go. Okay, so now it sets it back to the way it was in this calculate. And we're going to go, this calculate's going to clean up after itself and set the filters all the way back to blank. There we go. So now we get the filters all the way they were at the very beginning. And the actual result is the number 5. Cool. Okay, let's go do another one of those. That was fun. That was fun. It was fun for me. I don't know if it was fun for you. I hope it was informative if it wasn't fun. Even if it was painful, I hope it was at the very least, informative. All right, so in this one, again, we have a calculate inside of a calculate. So this outer calculate is going to revise the filters and then run a sub-expression. And in that sub-expression is another calculate, which has its own little teeny tiny sub-expression. And it will revise the filters and run its sub-expression. So let's do that. Okay, so we're starting with an empty filter context. We can go see all the rows right there. And here in the code, the very first thing we see is calculate. And whatever we see calculate, we want to go find the sub-expression and freeze it. So I'm going to select all of argument 1 right there, which I guess technically kind of ends at that comma right there, but this is close enough. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to freeze this. Brr, cold. Okay, so argument 1 of calculate is its sub-expression. It's only going to get run after we revise the filters. Argument 2, everything after that, comma, right, or arguments 2, 3, 4, 5, in this case there's just 2, is going to be how we want to change the filter. So we want to add a filter that is defined by this little snippet of code here from lines 13 through 16. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, we're going to use this derivation right here to get all the different types. So we're going to get types to go and dine in. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to do type. And I'm going to do to go. No, I'm not. I'm going to do to go. And I'm going to do dine in. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, right? So that is the derivation there on line 14, which we're going to pass into the filter iterator, which is going to take this temp table, add an expression column to it with that definition right there, and just keep the true rows. That's what the filter iterator does. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to type in EXP. And when I hit enter, I've already got the formula pre-populated. So does to go equal dine in? No, it does not. Does dine in equal dine in? It certainly does. So what does the filter iterator do? It's going to keep the true rows, and we're going to produce a temp table that looks like this. Type, and it's going to be dine in. Go ahead, hit enter. Okay, so calculate wants to run this sub-expression, but before it can do it, it has to revise the filters. We've provided it an override filter right there, so let's go ahead, which is that temp table right there. Let's go ahead and add it to the filter context. So I'm going to select it. Move my mouse, maybe. There we go, select it. There we go. So I'm going to get the little arrows. I'm going to move this up here, control, or left click and drag. I'm going to hold down control so that I can make a copy of it and let go. It's more accurate to say that I move it, but I like making a copy because I like being able to see it there and there. Okay, so the calculate function has taken the temp table produced by this snippet of code, added it to the filter context, revised the filters to create this new revised filter context. It can now unfreeze and run its sub-expression. Speaking of which, let's go select this big block of ice. We're going to unfreeze it. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to set it to that kind of color right there, so there's a little puddle behind it. Okay, and we can now run it under this filter context where type equals dine in. Speaking of which, let's filter our data model so we can see what the code sees. Okay, so now we're just looking at those dine-in rows. Okay, so now when we run the sub-expression, what's in the sub-expression? Another revisor, the calculate function, which means we're going to revise the filters again before we run this sub-expression, the sub-expression within the sub-expression. That's easy. We're going to go ahead and select that right there. I'm going to right click and I'm going to come up here, change the background color to this sort of blue color. Okay, we're freezing with our eyeballs. Calculate wants to run this sub-expression under a revised filter context, right? So this is going to be the thing that happens after we revise the filters. How do we revise the filters? Well, that's line 7 through 10 right there, right? Another instance where we take a derivation, pass it into the filter iterator to produce a temp table, which we'll then add to the filter context. Okay. So what's our derivation? Well, it's the all mini shift, right? And whenever we use this all function, that means it's a derivation that's going to temporarily ignore the filters, right? It's going to ignore the filters for purposes of getting that derivation. So even though, actually right now it wouldn't matter, we can see both lunch and dinner. Whenever we have that all derivation, we can we could think of it as all of the filters being gone for just a second, just long enough to produce that derivation. Okay, so we want all of the shifts, right? So we have lunch and dinner. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in shift, lunch, and dinner. Okay, so that is the derivation produced on line 8. And I'm going to go ahead and set the filters back to include that filter for dine-in, right? Because the all function temporarily ignores the filters, and now it's done getting its derivation, so we can think about the filters being in place again. Okay, so now what do? Well, the filter iterator is going to take the temp table produced by that derivation, right there, add this column to it, and just keep the true results. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in EXP. I hit enter, right? Does lunch equal lunch? Right? Does the shift equal lunch? It certainly does. So I get a true right there. Does dinner equal lunch? It does not, so I get a false. What does the filter iterator do with that new column? It's just going to keep the true row. So I'm going to type in shift, and I'm going to get lunch right there. Okay, so now this has produced a temp table. Calculate says, good, now I've got a temp table. I can add it to the filter context, then unfreeze and run that sub-expression. So I'm going to select this right here. Move right there until I get the little cardinal arrows. Left click and drag. I'm going to put this one next to the other one. Hold down Control and let go to make a copy of it. More accurate to say that I move it from there to there, but I like seeing it in both places, so I always make a copy, right? Good. So now, Calculate has taken that temp table, added it to the filter context. We can now unfreeze and run this sub-expression. And actually, this time, before we do it, let's go ahead and set the filter. So we already had a filter for dine-in. Let's add a filter for lunch. Let's add a filter for lunch. And we're not getting very many rows. And that's okay. Okay. So right now, this Calculate has created a filter context that looks like this. And with that new filter context in place, it can go ahead and unfreeze this sub-expression and run it. So I'm going to select that right there. Right-click. Give this a slightly darker background, so it's a puddle within a puddle for those 2 blocks of ice that we've melted, right? And so what are we doing here? Well, we go get all the visible rows of mini in the current filter context with a filter for type equals dine-in and shift equals lunch. We pass it to the SumX iterator, which adds this column to it and sums up the results. Easy, easy. So I'm going to select that right there. Control-C to copy it. Come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. I'm going to paste values. Click OK. There we go. Okay, so that's the result of that derivation there in the middle of line 5, which we pass into the SumX iterator, which is going to add that column to it, sum up the results. Hey, I've already got that done too. I type in EXP, and when I let go, notice for each and every row we get the units. Well, there's only 1 row, so we get 1 right there. And if we sum up the number 1, what do we get? Who's good at math? I'm not. Maybe some of you are. All right, so if I sum up the number 1, what do I get? I get the number 1, right? And so this is going to end up being the answer. But before we sort of completely finish, we're going to remember that revisers are good roommates. And since Calculate is a reviser, it's also a good roommate. So it's going to clean up after itself. So eventually we're going to return the number 1. Before we do that, we want to set the filters back one at a time to sort of go back to the way that they were. Okay. So the first iterator, or I'm sorry, the first filter that the most recent filter that we added was that one right there. So I'm going to Control-C. And I'm going to Control-V to paste. So this Calculate's going to undo the change that it made. So now we're just looking at dine-in. So I can go ahead and get rid of that filter for lunch. Okay. And then this Calculate's going to clean up after itself and remove that filter it added for type equals dine-in. So I already have that selected. Control-V to paste. And we can go ahead and look at all the rows. And if I want to, I can restart to install the latest Windows update. I'm not going to do that right now. We're in the middle of a video. Okay, so Calculate has finished cleaning up after itself, and the actual answer is the number 1. That's what we get. Okay, so here you could sort of see what happens when you have revisors inside of revisors. And this may seem in this video like it's a super advanced topic that you won't run into. In reality, you'll actually run into this a lot, right? And you'll actually have to get kind of good at noticing that if you use a revisor inside of a revisor, that this inner one happens afterwards, right? So whatever the override in here, if it disagrees with the outer one, the inner one will always win, right? And we can actually see a better example of that up here, right? Let's come back up here to our first example, right? So here, right, we revised the filters twice. In the outer one, we set a filter equal to lunch, and in the inner one, we set a filter equal to dinner. Well, since the outer one happens first, then the inner one happens, we add a filter for lunch, then we add a filter for dinner. And since they disagree, and this one happens afterwards, this is the one that wins. That's sort of the principle that you're going to have to learn. Okay. Well, I sure do hope that was helpful. It was kind of a fun concept, and I will see you in the next video.